Hi everyone, here's a little bit more historical context to help you understand this week's readings. We'll be reading Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne pretty soon. This story was actually written in 1835, which is more than 100 years after the time period we're currently studying. And I chose to include this story this week because Hawthorne's stories are often thematically relevant to the moral and religious tensions present during the colonial period. Hawthorne was pretty critical of Puritan values, and he was preoccupied with writing about the dark side of the early American soul. His great-great-grandfather, John Hathorne, was one of the judges who presided over the Salem witch trials, and he was called a witch judge. Apparently, Nathaniel Hawthorne added the W to his surname to distinguish himself from this famous ancestor, and I'll talk a little more about the Salem witch trials in a bit, and you'll see why Nathaniel might not have been so proud of this family connection. So here's a timeline just to get you situated in terms of the chronology of events that we'll be talking about today, so you can refer back to this if you ever get disoriented and you aren't sure where in history we are. There are 3 examples of the Puritans' persecuting spirit mentioned in Young Goodman Brown that we'll discuss in this video. The first is the persecution of American Indians, and specifically King Philip's War. That's mentioned on page 611 of your Norton's Anthology in the story Young Goodman Brown. The second thing that's mentioned is an intolerance for Quakers, which is also mentioned on that same page 611. And the third thing that Hawthorne is concerned with here is the Salem witch trials. And we'll talk about all 3 of these things in greater depth, and a few other things as well in this video. Before we dive right in, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about how these first religious settlers in New England governed themselves. So we've talked about John Winthrop and his model for a Christian utopia as a city on a hill that would stand as a model for the Church of England and help to inspire others to a more godly life. Winthrop wasn't just an inspirational speaker, though. He was also elected governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that came over to New England on the ship, the Arbella. So, as governor, Winthrop helped to establish the churches and the government in the colony, and he also negotiated with the local tribes for the land, because he felt that God intended the land to be taken for this good Christian cause. The Indians, or the American Indians, didn't feel this way, however, and over decades of these settlers taking their land, tensions began to rise, and eventually there was this big bloody war called King Philip's War, which happened in 1675. This was well after Winthrop died, by the way. Winthrop died in 1649. But in 1675, the Wampanoag people fought with the English settlers, and the English won, but at great cost to human life. 10% of the people fighting on both sides died, and it was really grisly. But the Puritans weren't really bothered by this. They didn't think it was immoral to kill the native people and take their land because the Puritans thought it was their destiny to do this. They were entitled to this land. It was part of their covenant with God, and it was completely legitimate as far as they were concerned. And that was sort of the overarching philosophy that governed their society as well. Remember that these Puritans called themselves Congregationalists because each church in their society had its own congregation, and that congregation elected its own minister and forged its own written covenant with God, and the elected minister of each congregation would put those rules into practice. And this system worked out for pretty much everyone because most of the people who came to America in the early 17th century shared common Calvinist beliefs. But there were some people who came who didn't have the same beliefs as these Congregationalists. You don't need to know all the different groups, but there were Quakers and Baptists and Antinomians and all sorts of groups that you probably haven't even heard of, and the Congregationalists didn't like these people. They thought they were dangerous because they were corrupting influences full of false ideas, and these Puritans and Pilgrims could be very hurtful and intolerant too. The Quakers, for example, were a Christian group who were, and still are, radically egalitarian, and they believe in the presence of God within every person. They're pacifist. They didn't feel like they needed a clergy. They emphasized a personal commitment to God. But these Quakers were often martyred for their beliefs. They were condemned to death and publicly hanged, which is pretty cruel and shocking to think about now. Another famous example of the cruel religious intolerance of this time is what happened to a woman named Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson disagreed with her minister, a man named John Cotton. And Cotton was a little bit more easygoing about the Calvinist theology than Anne Hutchinson was. Anne thought that salvation can only come from God. That's the idea I told you about last time called predestination. She believed you can't save yourself, only God can save you. But John Cotton, her minister, on the other hand, was a little more relaxed about his beliefs, and he said that maybe good deeds can lead to salvation. Maybe you can help yourself. It was a much more hopeful, optimistic view. But Anne Hutchinson was very disturbed by this. She thought this was heresy. So, she started forming her own weekly meetings at home to discuss theology as she thought it should be preached. And the other members of her clergy did not like this, because they were actually pretty encouraged by John Cotton's optimistic approach to their religion. So they banished Anne Hutchinson and her whole family in 1638, and she had to move all the way to Rhode Island, which was considered way out in the boonies back then. And this kind of excommunication or banishment happened to a lot of people at this time. There was this other guy named Roger Williams, who tried to put forth the idea that the clergy shouldn't have such a strong role in politics. Basically, he wanted the separation of church and state. But nobody liked that idea, so Williams also left for Rhode Island and started his own colony that was more religiously tolerant. Basically, Rhode Island was where all the outsiders had to go, and it wasn't always a great place to live. And Hutchinson actually ended up dying in an Indian raid about 5 years after she was banished. So as you can see, this was a very judgmental society. These early Americans weren't tolerant or forgiving of unorthodox opinions. It was a very conformist environment. And some say that the Puritans were marked by a spirit of persecution. And persecution means being hostile or violent towards people with political or religious beliefs that are a little bit different. So this intolerant atmosphere got more and more heightened for various reasons that we won't go into, until eventually in around the 1690s, which is like 70 years after the Mayflower, so several generations later, everything started getting weird, and it was the beginning of the end for the Puritan way. And nothing illustrates this better than the Salem witch trials. In the 17th century, most people strongly believed in witchcraft, and all throughout the century, hundreds of people had been accused of this crime in New England, and about 30 people had been hanged as witches. This phenomenon sort of reached a level of mass hysteria in 1692 during what is called the Salem witch trials, when there was this atmosphere of paranoia where suddenly people started seeing evidence of witchcraft everywhere, and they would maliciously and arbitrarily accuse people of practicing witchcraft. Within the span of 1 year, 1692, over 150 people were arrested and imprisoned, and of that number, about 20 were either hanged or crushed to death, and 5 died in prison because of the bad conditions there. So all this paranoia was sanctioned by the governing bodies of the time. These were legitimate hearings and prosecutions based on what we would nowadays consider superstitious and baseless evidence. All one had to do was accuse someone they didn't like, and the accused person would be cast under a shadow of suspicion. So oftentimes, accusations of witchcraft arose from personal grudges or other unrelated conflicts that had nothing to do with witchcraft. Shortly after the hysteria of the Salem witch trials died down, even the people of the time recognized that what had happened was really wrong and scary and shouldn't ever be repeated. And never again in American history did accusations of witchcraft lead to execution, thank goodness. This episode in history is sort of considered the end of Puritan authority in New England and the beginning of a new appreciation for rationalism and Enlightenment thinking that we'll talk about more later. So there you have it. I hope this made sense. Please email me or bring any questions you might have about the subject to class, and I'll see you guys then.